Hey guys, Dr. Snellgrove here, just recording a quick video to go over Toni Morrison's Recitatif, which is a very interesting story. It's a very unconventional story. I have very mixed feelings about it, which I mean, I don't want to editorialize too much. I love Toni Morrison, the author. I wrote my dissertation on one of her works that was, well, not this one, but this I was telling a face-to-face class not too long ago. It's almost better or almost more functional, might be a way of putting it, to think of this more as a reading exercise than the reading itself. By which I mean, you've got an interesting story here, but there's a gimmick that is kind of like front and center that you basically just have to be aware of when you are talking about this, and maybe when you're reading it, if you have a heads up going in, might help you understand a bit more of what's going on. So we got our two characters, right? We've got Twyla, who is our narrator, and we've got Roberta. And the text makes it clear that one of these characters is white and one of these characters is black. And the text does not make it clear which one is which. So, you've got a surface level, you can enjoy this just as an interesting story. I do find it interesting, but there's also an almost a context clues game going on of trying to figure out which is which and if it's even possible to do so. And if it is impossible, maybe that's part of the point. But anyways, let's dive in. I'm going to try to do a brief summary of this that I hope you guys find helpful. So we start out, Twyla and Roberta are 8 years old, and they are at an orphanage together, Saint Bonaventure's or Saint Bonnie's. And you get this very fun, like, kid mentality thing that everything gets a nickname. Saint Bonaventure is Saint Bonnie's. They have a teacher, administrator type figure that has a real name, but she's just called the Big Bozo by them. And the girls, interestingly, they don't get along at first, but they end up bonding together because this is kind of grim. They are the only ones in the orphanage whose mothers, at least, are still alive. Everyone else, the parents have died, they're with the state functionally. And then we get, it's literally the very first line of the story. Twyla tells us all, my mother danced all night and Roberta's was sick. That's why we were taken to St. Bonnie's. So the implication being, Roberta's was sick. That's simple enough, right? Although that will come into play in this story in a big way. And then Twyla, her mother danced all night. So the idea being that she's something of a party girl, maybe. So we get lots of stuff early on about their kind of misadventures at St. Bonnie's. And there's a character that doesn't, they just kind of glide over a brief description of her and interaction with her early in the story, and you might think, okay, we're never going to hear about Maggie again. And man, does Maggie come back into the story in a big way. So Maggie is, let's see, this is, again, Twyla is our narrator. This is the description about the kitchen woman with legs like parentheses, and she fell down there once as the big girls laughed at her. We know that Maggie is mute. And, kind of like kids tell stories. So there's a thing in here about, some of the kids said that, her tongue had been cut out. And Twyla's like, I'm pretty sure she's just born, mute. And she's got this interesting description saying she was old and sandy colored and she worked in the kitchen. Believe it or not, it's the sandy colored part that we're going to come back to because that becomes weirdly pertinent as the story goes on. And Maggie is either a pitiful or comic figure or a little of both. She wore, this is again the description, she wore this really stupid little hat, a kid's hat with ear flaps. And she wasn't much taller than we were. A really awful little hat. Even for a mute, it was dumb dressing like a kid, never saying anything at all. And they have this awkward interaction where, Twyla and Roberta are talking about her and she's close by. It's like, can she hear? I guess. Let's call her, Twyla said. Dummy, dummy. And she doesn't turn. And then they're like, bow legs, bow legs. And she doesn't, turn around. And Twyla, keep in mind, Twyla is now an adult woman looking back on her life. So she's talking about when she's 8, but she has some adult-sized regrets here. And there's a thing in here that also becomes important later on where it's, I think we were wrong. I think she could hear and didn't let on. And it shames me even now to think there was somebody in there after all who heard us call her those names and couldn't tell on us. All right. So we have this. I always laugh. I have a weird sense of humor, but we get this weird moment where both Twyla and Roberta's moms come and visit them on the same day, same time. They're going to be going to chapel together. And we get like just a night and day contrast between the two moms, right? So we get Twyla's mother, Mary, is in here. So I saw Mary right away. She had on those green slacks I hated and hate even more now because didn't she know we were going to chapel? And that fur jacket with the pocket lining so ripped she had to pull to get her hands out of them. So it's, you know, again, I'm extrapolating a little bit, but you know, Twyla's mom is the party girl, so it's almost like she rocked up like this is, you know, the clubbing clothes here, and that would have been, of course, awkward enough slash funny enough on its own. And then we get to see Roberta's mother. And I love this description. Twyla is narrating. I looked up, it seemed for miles. She was big, bigger than any man. And on her chest was the biggest cross I'd ever seen. I swear it was 6 inches long each way. And at the crook of her arm was the biggest Bible ever made. And I think this story is full of some fun human moments. Like Roberta's mom never actually says anything to Twyla's mom. So it's just Mary, simple-minded as ever, grinned and tried to yank her hand out of the pocket with a raggedy lining to shake hands, I guess. Roberta's mother looked down at me and then looked down at Mary too. She didn't say anything, just grabbed Roberta with her Bible free hand and stepped out of line, walking quickly to the rear of it. You know, so Roberta was like, oh, you know, I'm not even going to shake your hand. And then Mary has a very funny slash very human reaction here. Mary was still grinning because she's not too swift when it comes to what's really going on. Then this light bulb goes off in her head. She says, that bitch, really loud, and us almost in the chapel now. So just embarrassment all around, right? And so anyways, we have some time shifts in the story because like we go from this weird little anecdote talking about when Roberta left. It says Roberta left in May when apple trees were heavy and white. And so she leaves eventually. Mary leaves, and I'm sorry, Twyla leaves. Mary is Twyla's mom. And then we get the first of our really significant time jumps in the story. Because one of the stranger gimmicks, I keep using that word for this story, but one of the stranger gimmicks going on is that we keep moving forward years at a time. And there's never, I mean, you have to kind of piece together when the time shift happens. Like the first big one here, we go from them leaving the orphanage to, I was working behind the counter at the Howard Johnson's on the Thruway just before the Kingston exit. Not a bad job. And it's like, okay, the last we checked with the girls, they were 8, you know, so she's clearly, you know, a bit older, probably late teens, early 20s at this point, working at the Hojo. And she seems to, at least early on in this narration, kind of enjoy it, you know, relatively speaking. And then, as fate would have it, so Twyla's working there, and Roberta actually walks in. And so they have a little like, you know, oh, wow, that's you. Wow. And you think, oh, by the way, Roberta is in the company of some gentlemen. That's not code. She's just literally traveling together with these people. And so they're making, the girls are making, well, women now are making conversation. And Twyla tells Roberta, I live in Newburgh. And Roberta's, Newburgh? No kidding. She laughed then a private laugh that included the guys, but only the guys, and they laughed with her. What could I do but laugh too and wonder why I was standing there with my knees showing out from under that uniform? Without looking, I could see the blue and white triangle on my head, my hair shapeless in a net, my ankles thick in white Oxfords. Nothing could have been less sheer than my stockings. And so there's almost immediately this I guess you might call it like a class consciousness, class struggle going on, where implicitly, this is going to become super explicit pretty soon, but like implicitly right now, Roberta's like, oh, you live in the poor neighborhood. Oh, Newburgh, no kidding. And they laugh about it a little bit. And still, the conversation might have recovered a little bit. And Roberta tells Twyla, we're on our way to the coast. He's got an appointment with Hendrix. And she points to the boy next to her. And Twyla has this wonderfully socially awkward moment where she's like, Hendrix, fantastic. What's she doing now? And, Twyla's like, Hendrix, Jimi Hendrix, asshole. He's only the biggest. Oh, wow, forget it. And so for Twyla, this is basically like the last straw of being snubbed by her old friend. She says, well, she's thinking, narrating, I was dismissed without anyone saying goodbye, so I thought I would do it for her. How's your mother? I asked. Now, keep in mind, Roberta's the one with a sick mom. So this is the real like low blow here. Hey, how's your sick mom doing? And so Roberta says her grin cracked her whole face. She swallowed. Fine, she said. How's yours? Pretty as a picture, I said and turned away. The backs of my knees were damp. Howard Johnson's really was a dump in the sunlight. And so it's kind of subtle, I guess, but I like the idea that Twyla is pretty happy with her life until she sees it through the lens of Roberta. And I just thought that was the most human moment in the world. Like if you've ever, I've had so many weird jobs in my time, guys. I've worked fast food. I've been a busboy. I've been the dishwasher. And it is genuinely awkward. I don't know how many of you have had that experience, but like, you're working at McDonald's or something and your friends are coming in. And there's just that like, oh God, they gotta see me working my McJob here. It's a little strange. So she went from thinking, her job was pretty good to Howard Johnson's really was a dump in the sunlight. Fortunately, Twyla's got more than her job going for her. We can only hope that for all of us, right? She's married now to James Benton. They have one son together. And it's kind of interesting here. As we said earlier, they live in Newburgh, and her husband, who we only hear about, we never really see him, I don't think, James, she makes note about how his family doesn't, they see Newburgh the way it used to be, and she sees Newburgh the way it is. So there's a line here. This is presumably what Roberta's snobby ass was laughing about. Half the population of Newburgh is on welfare now, but to my husband's family, it was still some upstate paradise of a time long past. But here's where it gets interesting. Well, you might be like, interesting is relative. So it's like the place is, at least when Twyla moves in there, the place is very poor. But her husband remembers when it was a nice, old-timey town, a small American town. But now, again, there's context clues that give you hints, among other things, to when this takes place. So the story is written in 1983, but it's kind of jumping forward. But it starts in the far past. I say decades had passed, and so it says that something quick was in the air. Magnificent old houses, so ruined they had become shelter for squatters and rent risk, were bought and renovated. Smart IBM people moved out of their suburbs back into the city and put shutters up and herb gardens in their backyards. So it's like computers are now, becoming a big thing. Now, when I say big thing, that's quite literal. I think this was back when they were still like room-sized computers. But it's clear like this is the future. And so you get this. I mean, I don't know. They don't use this word in the story. I don't think this was a super common word back then. But basically, gentrification. It's what is happening here. It's like it's the poor town. All these people had moved. All the wealthier people had moved out of the poor town into the suburbs, but now they're coming back in. And of course, shocking nobody, right? It is Roberta is the fancy one. So they run into each other again now in Newburgh. A little irony there. Roberta is of course living in the place she was snotty about, and so they start talking with each other, and this interaction is a little, well, it's a lot more positive than the other one. They're actually playing pleasant catch up and pleasant conversation, but there's still this kind of divide, at least in Twyla's perception. There's a friction between them, and she brings it up. And again, there's several of these moments in the story where it's like there's clearly a racial element here, but the story tiptoes right up. That's the tiptoe sign, right? Tiptoes right up and doesn't spell out who is whom or who is what. So, for instance, we got this is like what do you call it? Twyla's narration, where it's like she hears that Roberta lives in Annandale, which is like a really fancy, area, and so she's thinking to herself, but she was waiting for me, and her huge hair was sleek now, smooth around a small, nicely shaped head. Shoes, dress, everything lovely and summery and rich. I was dying to know what happened to her, how she got from Jimi Hendrix to Annandale, a neighborhood full of doctors and IBM executives. Easy, I thought. Everything is so easy for them. They think they own the world. So there's race resentment going on here, and we're not going to get a lot into it right now. I mean, pretty much all of this, that's the whole point. It's up to your interpretation. But this is a real interesting moment because, like, depending on whether you think Twyla is white or black, will severely affect your perception of Twyla in this moment, right? So imagine that Twyla is black and she's looking at like her old friend, former friend, if Roberta's white, it's like, oh, she's gentrifying the neighborhood. And, Twyla's thinking, so easy for them. They think they own the world. It's like, okay, that would be sort of understandable. I mean, that's still how people react to like white gentrifiers in black neighborhoods to this day. But if Twyla is white and she's thinking this about her black friend, like everything's so easy for them. They think they own the world. It's like, this would have been leading up to or in the midst of like the civil rights era. So it's like, oh God, Twyla. So one of my face-to-face students just asked me point blank, like, Dr. Snellgrove, who do you think? And I was like, I want to believe I want to believe Twyla is black, because otherwise I think I might hate her. Like, they think they own the world. Like, God, it's wild. So anyways, they talk more, they catch up, they're both married. Twyla tells her about, I'm married to this guy. We got one kid together. And Roberta is married to a guy, and they have 4 kids, but they are stepchildren. Believe it or not, that will come into play. Is the only reason I'm emphasizing that, because her husband's a widower. And her husband, shocking nobody, he is one of the IBM guys, so he's a pretty wealthy person. And, you probably could have figured that out just at a guess, but the text makes that very clear, where, they're getting groceries. They're at the grocery store and they come out and like the car has been pulled around for Roberta. It's a dark blue limousine and she's got a driver, and they have a fun, they laugh a little bit about it. And then let's see, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. Like, oh yeah, they talk more about just how wealthy Roberta is, where Twyla just point blank asks her, servants and all, and Roberta holds up 2 fingers, like they have 2 servants in the house. I do love this reaction, because Twyla asked the same question you'd probably ask if your friend said, I have live-in servants. Very deeply uncomfortable concept, isn't it? She's like, ow, what does he do? Talking about the husband. And Roberta's like, computers and stuff. What do I know? And so it's one of those things where I don't know. I've known spouses where like one of them works, some sort of computer field, and the other one doesn't quite know what they do. That's always the answer, right? What do they do? Computers and stuff. So anyway, they get all of a sudden Maggie comes back into the narrative. They start talking about her, and Twyla's like, hey, remember Maggie? That day she fell down and the Gargirls, that was their name for the mean girls, laughed at her. And Roberta's like, Maggie didn't fall. No, Twyla, they knocked her down. Those girls pushed her down. They tore her clothes in the orchard. Well, that's not what happened. Sure it is. In the orchard? Remember how scared we were? Oh, wait a minute. I don't remember any of that. And so they kind of go back and forth. And we get this interesting revelation that, Roberta left St. Bonnie's first, but she says she actually came back. So she was there to see Bozo get fired. Doesn't say exactly what for. Probably something a little sinister, right? But it's like she says she came back twice, and then the second time she ran away, which shocks Twyla. And Roberta says, I had to. What do you want? Me dancing in that orchard? Which is something Maggie used to do. So I keep saying we're going to come back to that. We are going to come back to that. I'm just making my way through. I'm sorry. I hope this isn't overly pedantic or redundant for you guys. That's just for my face-to-face classes. I usually do this kind of let's summarize the story, summarize it, contextualize it, all that fun stuff. All right. And then, anyways, after all these pleasantries, Twyla kind of comes back to their weird interaction at the Hojo. And she's like, hey, that time, were you like on dope or something? And so Roberta is telling her, like, maybe a little. I never did drugs much. Why? Oh, I don't know. You acted sort of like you didn't want to know me then. Oh, Twyla, you know how it was in those days, black, white. You know how everything was. And, again, alluding to the racial disparity between them, maybe. And we get more of this internal Twyla narration. She's like, I didn't know. I thought it was just the opposite. Busloads of blacks and whites came into Howard Johnson's together. They roamed together then. Students, musicians, lovers, protesters. You got to see everything at Howard Johnson's, and blacks were very friendly with whites in those days. But sitting there with nothing on my plate but 2 hard tomato wedges, wondering about the melting Klondikes, it seemed childish remembering the slight. So yeah, it's again an interesting, like, Roberta's perception here. It's like, oh yeah, I was weird to you because that's just how black people and white people were back then. And Twyla is biting her tongue, which is like, I'm not in my experience. No, that was not the case. But and she's a little haunted by the Maggie business. After they say goodbye, she's thinking, oh well, Roberta does the polite thing. No, look, call me, okay? Okay, I said. And Twyla's thinking, but I knew I wouldn't. Roberta had messed up my past somehow with that business about Maggie. I wouldn't forget a thing about that, would I? All right. So do we get another, a briefer time jump where it's Strife came to us that fall. So, it's just like a season or 2 later. The newspapers are calling it racial strife. And so, again, you have to use context clues to figure out a lot of when this is happening, / what is happening. But, I mentioned earlier the civil rights era. And so it sounds like what they are reacting to is, desegregation / school integration, where it's like, all right, kids are now getting bused to different schools. So we no longer have like white only schools and black only schools. And so there's protests in the streets. And so Twyla's thinking, Joseph was on the list of kids to be transferred from the junior high school to another one at some far out of the way place. I thought it was a good thing until I heard it was a bad thing. I mean, I didn't know. And so she sees these protesters. They're like out picketing, right? That's got to be the picketing sign. And then she sees Roberta on the picket line. And Roberta's got this big ass sign that says, mothers have rights too. And so Twyla first thinks she's going to drive by. And then she's like, nah, I'm going to talk to her. So they talk about it. Like, what are you doing, Roberta? Picketing. What's it look like? What for? What do you mean, what for? They want to take my kids and send them out of the neighborhood. They don't want to go. So what if they want to go to another school? My boy's being bused. I don't mind. Why should you? It's not about us, Twyla, me and you. It's about our kids. What's more us than that? Well, it's a free country. Not yet, but it will be. What the hell does that mean? I'm not doing anything to you. You really think that? I know it. And then the both of them, one of them's like, I wonder what made me think you were different. And they get that response. And then Twyla tries to appeal to her using their common past. Look at them. Who do they think they are? Swarming all over the place like they own it. And now they think they can decide where my child goes to school? Look at them, Roberta. They're bozos. And Roberta's like, no, they're just mothers. What am I, Swiss cheese? I used to curl your hair. I hated your hands in my hair. So it's getting ugly, and trust me, it's about to get uglier. But this is one of the chief sections where it's like, one of them is black, one of them is white, and which, your judgment of which is going to severely affect how you interpret this, right? Because like, if Roberta is white, could be a bad look, probably is a bad look, right? I don't want them bussing my kids out. But if you take Roberta at face value, it could just be like, she's a mom, her kid, he likes her kids, they like their school, they have friends there, maybe they don't want to go to a new school. But then you start getting into all of this, it's not about us, Twyla, me and you, it's about our kids. What's more us than that? Well, it is a free country. Not yet, but it will be. So that starts getting very, very interesting, right? It's Roberta saying it's a free country. It's Twyla saying not yet, but it will be. What does that mean? Is Roberta like a white mother that's very annoyed? Like I should have the freedom to to take my kids where they want to go. And then Twyla is a black mother saying, to the saying it's a free country, not yet, but it will be. Like she's in favor of the busing, but then again, like, hey, this is the key to integrating, like desegregating schools. But we had that earlier bit where Twyla seemed a little ambivalent about it, right? I didn't think it was bad until I was told to think it was bad. So what's going on? And then Roberta, what the hell does that mean? I'm not doing anything to you. You really think that? So again, it gets very interesting. Like, well, I keep saying that, but where Roberta, like, if Roberta is a white woman, I'm not doing anything to you. You really think that? Could be an implicit, you're part of the problem. But Roberta could be, a black woman. What the hell does that mean? I'm not doing anything to you. Twyla's the one. You really think that? And so, again, I can't escape the idea that if Twyla is white, she's a very I hate both of these characters, I guess is what I'm saying. Like Roberta is a snob no matter what. And if Twyla's white, oh my God, it's next level. Like you're doing something to me. It's like, what are you doing to me? But what is that going on? And some of my students, like, I don't even really want to go there. But some of my students, face-to-face students, we were talking about this in class, and you even get to stuff like, I used to curl your hair. I hated your hands in my hair. So it's Roberta saying, I used to curl your hair. I hated your hands in my hair. And so I literally, they weren't, getting mean about it or anything, but I had students that were looking at that and like one person saying, oh, okay, it must be like, Twyla is the one that wanted help with her curling her hair. And then, Roberta, I had a student just straight up like, yeah, maybe Roberta is like the stereotype of white people wanting to put their hands in your hair. It's like, oh, but maybe that is the other way around, right? The idea of, I used to curl your hair. There's nothing inherently racial about that. I hated your hands in my hair. There's nothing inherently racial about that. So we got to figure it out. Anyways, I know I'm kind of keeping an eye on the clock. All right. So, they Roberta keeps protesting, and then all of a sudden, like Twyla gets it in her. Oh, sorry, I'm not quite, or I was skipping ahead a little bit. They did have they start talking about Maggie again. Remember, I said Maggie just keeps popping back up in this story, and let's see, it starts getting ugly between the two of them. Where let's see, here's Roberta. Maybe I am different now, Twyla, but you're not. You're the same little state kid who kicked a poor old black lady when she was down on the ground. You kicked a black lady, and you have the nerve to call me a bigot. And Twyla's sitting there like, what was she saying? Black? Maggie wasn't black. And then she tells her that. Like hell she wasn't, and you kicked her. We both did. You kicked a black lady who couldn't even scream. Liar. You're the liar. Why don't you just go on home and leave us alone then? So again, it starts getting very weird, where it's like, okay, so is Roberta a black woman who is righteously angry? Like, don't get on your high horse. You kicked a black woman. Or is Roberta a white woman that's pulling this reverse Uno card? Like, you can't take the moral high ground with me. I saw you abuse a black woman, old black woman before. Don't know. What I do know is that Twyla becomes an OG troll here, where, because Roberta never changes her sign, the big protest sign that says, mothers have rights too. And so Twyla brings out the first of her multiple troll protest signs that just says, and so do children, which is hilarious because, well, maybe not haha funny, but Roberta is the one that is, actually part of the protest. And Twyla's signs only make sense in context with Roberta. Like she's a counter protester of exactly one person. And so then I love this bit. At some point, when people looks over her sign, and so do children. What? It's like, yeah, it doesn't make sense. And then Twyla just starts getting meaner and meaner with this shit. So like the next day, Roberta's out there with mothers have rights too. And now Twyla has a sign saying, "How would you know?" Which, as near as I can tell, is picking at her for being a stepmother, which is just really cruel. And then, at that point, the first time I was reading the story, I thought Twyla couldn't sink any lower. And the next day, she comes in, she says, "I brought a painted sign in queenly red with huge black letters that said, 'Is your mother well?'" Roberta took her lunch break and didn't come back for the rest of the day or any day after. 2 days later, I stopped going too, and couldn't have been missed because nobody understood my signs anyway. And so, yeah, it's like all this protesting. It says it was a nasty 6 weeks, and then we get yet another time shift where it's like I couldn't help looking for Roberta when Joseph graduated from high school. So we don't know. I don't know if we know exactly how old her son was earlier, but presumably, at least some years have passed. So he's graduating, and they see Twyla sees that it's around the holidays now, around Christmas time, and she sees that there is like a big Christmas party that is being thrown in this like fancy looking hotel. And so she goes and checks it out, and you guessed it, she runs into Roberta again, right? And so Roberta actually comes up to her. It's like, "I have to tell you something, Twyla. I made up my mind. If I ever saw you again, I'd tell you." And Twyla is like, "I just as soon not hear anything, Roberta. It doesn't matter now anyway." Which is, after all that next level petty trolling, Twyla seems to be doing the like, maybe let's not restart the fight. And then Roberta's like, "No, not about that." And so it's about St. Bonnie's and Maggie. And so I swear we're on the last page where he's like, "God, this man just keeps talking." Not that we won't talk after the story, but Roberta tells Twyla, "Listen to me. I really did think she was black. I didn't make that up. I really thought so. But now I can't be sure. I just remember her as old, so old. And because she couldn't talk, well, I thought she was crazy. She'd been brought up in an institution like my mother was, and like I thought I would be too. And you were right. We didn't kick her. It was the gargoyles, only them. But, well, I wanted to. I really wanted them to hurt her. I said we did it too, you and me, but that's not true. And I don't want you to carry that around. It was just that I wanted to do it so bad that day. Wanting to is doing it." And at this point, she's kind of crying a bit, and Twyla's, feeling a little pity for her. So, "We were kids, Roberta, and so we were kids. We were just 8. We were lonely. We were scared." And then it looks like they're just gonna have a normal goodbye. And then Twyla tells her, it's like, "Did I tell you, my mother, she never did stop dancing?" And Roberta says, "Yes, you told me. And mine, she never got well." Roberta lifted her hands from the tabletop and covered her face with her palms. When she took them away, she really was crying. "Oh shit, Twyla. Shit, shit, shit. What the hell happened to Maggie?" And that's the end of the story. This seemingly minor character, mentioned earlier, like when they're 8 at the orphanage, is haunting them, just like looming large over their memories here at the end. All right, so that does beg the question, inevitably, right? What is up with Maggie? Because it seems more Roberta's focus on Maggie than Twyla's necessarily. Twyla has a surface level guilt of, "Hey, I don't want to, I feel bad that we yelled at her that one time being rude. She probably could hear us." But why would this all of a sudden be, what do you call it? Roberta feeling so weird about this? My theory, I don't know how many of you have suffered through psychology yet, but my theory is that we're having a classic paging Dr. Freud sort of moment here, where we get kind of explicitly at some points, Roberta is comparing herself to Maggie, at least, well, explicitly, at least that one time when she talks about running away from Saint Maggie's, or I'm Saint Maggie's, gosh, it might as well be Saint Maggie's at this point, right? Saint Bonnie's. She says, "What do you want? Me dancing in that orchard?" And which is, how they remember Maggie. It's like, "Well, you want me to end up like her?" And then she says this thing here about, she'd been brought up at an institution like my mother was, and like I thought I would be too. So there's this idea that she identifies with Maggie in a way that kind of scares her and that she doesn't understand. Like Maggie is sort of the dark, it could happen to you, like what if I never ran away from the institution? What if I couldn't talk? Would I just have been here forever? What a miserable life, getting beaten up, by youngsters, what a miserable life that would be. So like in Maggie, in this pitiful figure, Roberta sees herself and she sees her mom. She had been brought up in an institution like my mother was. And so how does Roberta react, at least in her mind, with anger, with, wannabe violence even. So again, I feel like I'm leading you guys to a Sigmund Freud fortune cookie here, but why does Roberta hate Maggie? Roberta hates Maggie as Roberta hates herself, And I'm sorry, this is like, I feel bad that we're focusing so much on Maggie, but then again, the story focuses so much on Maggie. And this is something I wanted to mention to you that I didn't really think about until the other day. So I hope you find it interesting too, because this story has a weird name, right? Recitatif. And I don't know if any of you ended up Googling this, like, what the hell does that even mean? If you did, you would have found out real quick. That's not really a word per se. There are other words, that this seems to be a form of, but Morrison, kind of created a word here. So I was looking at, it seems to be a combination of recitation and recitative. And so I'm looking at I'm going to provide these definitions and talk briefly about this with you. So like a recitation is the public reading aloud of something or reciting of something from memory. And so and of course, recitative as an adjective of or relating to or having the character of a recital or a recitation. So here's my hot take, because I know that's why you took the classes, Dr. Snellgrove's hot takes on literature, baby. So if we think of this as, okay, recitative, it's like the reading aloud of something or reciting of something from memory. So memory is central to this story, right? The idea of these girls, they basically grew up together, some very formative years together, but they have these very different ideas about what actually happened in the past, these things that they can't quite agree on. And that's actually very, very significant in the sense of like, well, you can never remember the past fully as it was. That's the trap of nostalgia, right? Nobody actually misses the past. They miss who they were when the past, when it was in the past. But the story in many ways, on kind of a meta level, maybe, it's the story of these two girls trying to reconstruct their past. But there's these inevitable disagreements because it's not one person's recitation of what happened. It's two people. They can't quite get on the same page, and they have these weird, different memories here. And so we actually, that's how the story basically ends, is a lament that they collectively can't figure out exactly what happened to Maggie. What the hell happened to Maggie? I mean, I think they are, of course, concerned with her as a person. I like to think so on a human level. But there is also this idea that, if they could figure out what happened to Maggie, finding that out with any kind of certainty would also mean finding out more about their own past. Finding out more about who they really were at this very formative time in their lives. All right. So I hope I haven't talked your ear off about this. It's an interesting story. Like I said, it's not my favorite read it for pleasure kind of story, but as an exercise for the reader, Toni Morrison is just constantly asking you to be on the lookout for context clues, be on the lookout, what's happening. When is it happening? I didn't even get into the sentence level stuff of, when, what do you call it? Like Twyla refers to Howard Johnson's as a shelter and she left an orphanage. It's like, the idea that, her psychological perception of this place. And of course, we talked about how that perception changes. It's a shelter that she likes most of the time. And then Roberta comes in being snobby about her friend being kind of poor. And now all of a sudden it's like, Howard Johnson's really was a dump in the sunlight. So there's a lot going on here. Some interesting characters, psychological motivations, us trying to reconstruct, what really happened. And this is just food for thought. I really am about to end this. I know you're all like, God, this guy can't talk forever, can he? But I was just going to say that in many ways, this is a literary device that is still alive and well. Like, I don't know how many of you might have read the Game of Thrones books. I know it's called the Song of Ice and Fire series, and Game of Thrones was the first one. Don't yell at me. But if you've read those books, or maybe I should say if you haven't, this might come as a surprise to you. Each chapter is told from like a various character's perspective. So there's no one narrator giving you objective truth. It's like, here's the Tyrion chapter, and here's a Jon Snow chapter. It'll go back to them. It's not like they only get one chapter, but you have to constantly be thinking about this. And so there are cases where it's like, multiple characters were at the same event, they perceived XYZ things differently. And it's like, people end up looking like Charlie from It's Always Sunny, the conspiracy theory thing, trying to figure out what's going on. So I was just to say that this is a smaller story, a little bite-sized version of that kind of thing. And I don't know, I get a kick out of trying to figure out what's going on in these stories, but you don't get a PhD in literature if you don't enjoy analyzing literature, right? But that's about it. You guys know the drill. If you have any questions about this or anything else, feel free to email me. Feel free to text me at 863-835-2399. Have a good one. Bye.